In behavior analysis, we have a technical way in which we talk about concepts and concept formation or category learning. In this case, we define concept formation as discrimination between classes of stimuli and generalization within classes of stimuli. Many psychologies talk about category learning or category formation or concept formation. But what we've done in behavior analysis is divide it in such a way that we can study it. We can show that because we affect discriminations in particular ways, we affect generalization within in particular ways, that it demystifies what concepts are in this respect. If we define it this way, we think this is what is going on, but we can also study it in the laboratory. We can study it and see it right in front of us. So the original experiments and demonstrations of concept learning in animals, believe it or not, in pigeons, was done by Richard Herrnstein. And what Herrnstein did was he had his graduate students go out and take pictures of various things. In this case, what we see is a picture of a tree and a picture of a goldfish. And he had them take hundreds and hundreds of pictures of natural items, he called them. Now, no two pictures were the same. And what he did was he loaded these pictures up in a slide carousel. He made slides of all these pictures, loaded them up in a slide carousel, and then was able to present these pictures to pigeons in a chamber, in a Skinner box, in an operant chamber, in an experimental chamber. And they were able to peck on those pictures, and he was able to made this device, essentially built this chamber that the pigeons could peck at these pictures, and he could detect when that pigeon was responding to that picture and set up a set of conditions. What he did was, Bradley Cooper. What he did was present pairs of stimuli, and pecking on one of those pictures was correct, and presenting and pecking on one of the pictures was incorrect. And what he saw over time, was that the pigeons began to peck on pictures of trees and not peck on pictures of non-trees. But they never saw the same picture twice. So his argument was that the pigeon had a concept of tree, even though each of these stimuli were different. Now, this was an interesting comparison, and that is the pigeons had trouble with this discrimination. Some of the pigeons pecked on this picture over here, and it was an interesting backstory because there's a tree, and the pigeons pecked this as tree, and the experimenter said, no, you're wrong, when in fact they were right. So in a sense, what this experiment was about was the pigeons' discriminations versus the experimenter's discriminations. And the experimenters didn't discriminate. There are a few classic examples. These particular stimuli aren't actually from Herrnstein's experiment, but there are some stimuli in the experiment that were demonstrated to be a failure of discrimination on the part of the experimenter, not on the part of the subject. So what we see over time in Herrnstein, Loveland, and Cable is we see the animal responding to pictures of trees and not responding to other examples. So what is going on? People would say, well, they have the concept of a tree, but that's really not very meaningful for a behavior analyst. We want to know what that means or what that entails. So let's take a look at discrimination. Yes, they are discriminating between trees and not trees, trees and goldfish, trees and humans, trees and water, trees and non-trees. But what makes a tree? And that's what we think is generalization, is a tree is behaving similarly to similar classes of stimuli, behaving similarly in different situations. Now, not all of these trees are the same, but we would call them all a tree. Now, the interesting thing about this story is that when Herrnstein and Levelin and Cable seem to convincingly demonstrate that what's going on is discrimination between classes of stimuli and generalization within classes of stimuli, they were criticized because they used a tree. And of course, a pigeon knows what a tree is because a pigeon has to fly and land in trees, and it behaves with respect to trees. So of course it has the concept of tree. But what Herrnstein wanted to demonstrate was that they could have arbitrary concepts that didn't have to do with just things that were in the evolutionary history of the pigeon. And it turns out that you can teach pigeons to discriminate pictures of goldfish from other things. You can form the concept of goldfish. You could form the concept of water. They criticized him on water because, of course, the pigeon has to drink and so on. It should know what water is. But goldfish and so on. But the more definitive demonstration was this discrimination. And that is a group of researchers just a few years ago, 20 years ago or so, trained pigeons on discrimination between these two painters, Picasso and Monet. And the pairs of stimuli were just like the trees and non-trees, except some pigeons got pictures of Monet and pictures of not Monet, and other pigeons got pictures of Picasso and not Picasso. And what they learned was the concept of Monet, the concept of Picasso. They could discriminate paintings by Picasso versus paintings by other artists. The other pigeons could discriminate pictures by Monet versus paintings by other. And the funny thing about this experiment, there are a couple of funny things. The first thing was when they were presented this discrimination, this is Manet, this is Braque, is the pigeons that were trained on the Monet, not Monet discrimination said this looked like Monet, and the pigeons that were trained on the Picasso versus non-Picasso discrimination said this looked like Picasso. So what we have here in pigeons actually is the concept Impressionism and the concept Cubism, not just on the particular artist, but maybe even a greater sort of concept. Funny thing about this experiment too was if the experimenters turned this painting upside down, the pigeons didn't know what it was. But if they turned this painting upside down, the pigeons did just fine. They recognized this. They discriminated this as a Cubist painting. So that's a little bit of a funny story. Hopefully that helps with concept formation.